Hello everyone, we'd like to thank you for joining us tonight where we're going to be talking about some helicopter safety, and this is a national presentation we have on making life and death decisions. It is an International Helicopter Safety Foundation case study that we're going to take a look at that happened out in Alaska. We do want to thank you for joining us with the New England FAASTeam. It is terrific to have you here this evening. All of us are here. We have Dan Carter from the Bradley FAASTO, furthest over on your left. Also from Bradley, on the airworthiness side, next to him in the blue vest, is Rob Leonard. John Wood is the next as you proceed over to the right. And I'm Stephen K. Brown, the one up in the front, furthest over to your right. Here's our contact information. We would love to hear from you if you do have any questions about the WINGS program or about the webinars that we do. This is how you can contact any of us. Again, Dan and Rob are down in the Bradley FAASTO, John Wood with the Portland, Maine FAASTO, and I myself, I'm with the Boston FAASTO. We do have actually a special guest speaker, is Matt Hall, who is an aviation safety inspector, helicopter for the Portland, Maine office. John and I have seen him flying around very much, and we're so happy to have him join the FAA here finally after, trying to convince him for quite a few years. And he really is a specialist, and he's going to do a terrific webinar for you. So we do want to thank Matt for joining us. So sit back and enjoy.
So good morning, everybody. As John said, I'm a safety inspector with the Portland Flight Standards Office. And this presentation was put together by the International Helicopter Safety Foundation. And the whole intent here is to reach as many helicopter people as they can with this campaign that is really focused on getting some important safety messages out. And they asked the FAA to participate in this, and we're happy to do so. So we're going to spend most of our time in this workshop today thinking about and discussing the specific sequence of events that unfortunately led to a tragic outcome in this case. So I'm going to introduce you to a very capable helicopter pilot who was trying to do a noble deed, and he had done this many times before. And as we go through this, I'd like you to put yourself into this pilot's place and think carefully about what you would have done in his situation as the events leading to the accident unfold. And try to leave your biases, your judgments, assumptions out if you can. I understand that all of us have not been in an identical situation, but the human factors and safety recommendations that we're going to talk about are relevant to all helicopter pilots, regardless of where you work or fly. I think there's something to learn from every accident, no matter what our background is from. So we've got a poll question. John, if you wouldn't mind bringing that up, please.
Sure, Matt, just give me a second. We'll pull up poll number 1.
Thank you, sir.
You betcha. Okay, so here's poll question number 1. What type of helicopter flying do you do the most? Recreational and personal, or personal? Flight instruction, scenic tours, EMS, which is emergency medical services, SAR, which is search and rescue, law enforcement, utility, or corporate charter. So please go ahead, answer the questions, and then we'll show you what the results are. Okay, so we have about 65% of you that have voted. And we're just going to give you a few more minutes. Okay, we're at about 70%, and it looks like right about there, the voting has stopped. So I'm going to close the poll and then share it with everybody. Okay, so what type of helicopter flying do you do the most? It looks like number 1 was EMS, SAR, and law enforcement. That makes up the biggest part of our audience today, 47%. Number 2 was recreational and personal at 25%. Number 3 was flight instruction, scenic tours at 15%. Number 4 was corporate and charter at 11%, and utility accounted for 2%. So it looks like, Matt, we've got EMS, then recreational, and then flight instruction.
Okay, awesome, John, thanks. So with these webinars, it's difficult to, obviously to connect with you folks, and I really enjoy hearing other people's experiences and getting that kind of participation, and that's difficult to do in this situation. So it's helpful to at least know what the background of everybody is, and it looks like we've got a diverse background of helicopter folks. And obviously, I'm not going to poll everybody's individual hours and things like that, but it's helpful for me to know just as we go through. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is latent conditions. So as you can see by the slide, it's something that is in and of itself not not that cause of the accident. It's a condition that typically lies dormant, but when coupled with an error, results in an undesirable outcome. It's not just the person who flipped the proverbial switch, so to speak. It could be the poor design of the switch itself. It could be a lack of training on how the switch works or how to use it. So as we lay out what happened on this accident, I want you to think of some of the potential latent conditions or latent factors that contributed to the accident's outcome. So here are some examples. So glare from the instrument panel, so it could be an environmental concern, frayed wire, and as you can see in that picture, a poorly placed fence. In and of itself, these things are not necessarily causing an accident. So we're going to talk first about the pilot. Actually, I'm sorry. We're gonna show a video first. Forgot about that. You probably have seen this video. This was viral for quite some time. Okay, so before I talk about the video, I would like to find out what you folks think of the video. So we're going to bring up another poll question, John, if you don't mind bringing that up.
You bet, Matt. Here we go. So what is the first thing you thought after viewing that video? Did you think awesome pilot? Did you think incredible skill? Did you think, wow, that's awesome? Or did you think unnecessary risk? Please vote. All right, it looks like about 60% of you. We'll keep the poll open for a few more seconds. Okay, great. There's still a few more people voting. We'll just give it a couple more seconds and then I'll close it out. All right, that looks like about it. So I'm going to close it and I'm going to share it with you. So here are the results. Most of you thought unnecessary risk at 60%. Number 2 answer was incredible skill at 38%. 2% thought awesome pilot, and nobody thought that's awesome. And we had about 75% of you that voted. So Matt, it looks like unnecessary risk really kind of is in the lead by quite a bit, and then incredible skill, and then you know, a couple for awesome pilot. That's it, and that's awesome didn't come in at all. So I'm going to hide this, and the screen's coming back to you, Matt.
All right, thanks, John. So the reason I showed that is it was all over the place, and the responses on YouTube, the news media, social media were overwhelmingly positive. And I think, to me, this highlighted kind of a natural opinion or regard for people in those types of positions, you know, firefighters and things like that. People that risk their lives for others are just highly regarded, you know, for their courage and their ability to do that. And I think in aviation, that's certainly an admirable trait to have, but it's not always appropriate. So I'm encouraged to see that there were quite a few of you that thought it was an unnecessary risk. Of course, if you haven't guessed already, that's where my head is at. And that's, you know, maybe based on a little bit of research on my part. I saw this video and I immediately thought to myself, why do we need to put the blades that close to the slope? I'd just seen an accident a couple of years before of a helicopter chopping its blades into the mountain and rolling down. So I did a little research on the operator and, you know, the types of missions they do, and they're a highly trained group of people. There's no doubt about that. And you can't, you know, Monday morning quarterback all of their decisions. And heck, there are a lot more skilled and experienced pilots than I will ever be. That's for sure. But you really do have to take a step back sometimes and think, do I have that what we call mission mindset? You know, am I just trying to make the mission here? Is there some other way that I can do this? And I think in many cases that mindset could be a latent condition, as we talked about before. So we're going to talk about the pilot in question here, Mr. Mel Nading. There's a couple of photographs of him. So he was 55 years old, born in 1957. He was a member of the U.S. Army, joined in 1975, was a mechanic, served in Germany. After the Army, he went to work for Duncan Aviation in Nebraska as a mechanic. He moved to Alaska in '81, started a family, and became a flight instructor for Gordon Aviation and worked on the North Slope for Camco Alaska. He joined the Alaska National Guard and graduated from flight school in 1985. He went back to Texas, or went back to the South, moved to Texas for a short time, and he flew fixed wing between Dallas and Galveston for Northwestern Air Cargo. And he also worked as a pilot for Petroleum Helicopters Incorporated, PHI, down the Gulf. Ended up moving back to Alaska in '88 and got a job with Trans-Alaska Helicopters as chief pilot and director of operations. And he was with Trans-Alaska for 12 years. In 2000, he was hired as the primary pilot for Alaska Department of Public Safety, DPS, in support of various missions, a lot of search and rescue. He was, in fact, the primary search and rescue pilot in those 12 years and provided helicopter support to the Alaska State Troopers and wildlife troopers for numerous kinds of missions, law enforcement, including special reaction team, rescued countless people. He was also an instructor pilot for both the department's A-Star and R-44 helicopters, and routinely certified department pilots on both types of helicopters. He was well admired, well respected among the search and rescue community. he was known by others for his attention to safety and his extraordinary skill as a pilot. He was named Chief Rescue Pilot of the Year in 2004 by the Alaska Mountain Rescue Group for successfully flying members day and night under adverse conditions, is what the award read. In 2008, he was the recipient of the Governor's Denali Peak Performance Award and a commendation for meritorious service for saving the life of a kayaker caught in a board tide in 2007. According to the article, his phenomenal flying skills enabled him to hold the helicopter steady and close to the waters as Sergeant Bryan of the state troopers leaned out and pulled the kayaker up, saving the man's life. This is just one of the countless rescues that Mr. Nading can be credited with. He was also awarded a 2001 commendation for honorable service for a daring rescue and a 2003 commendation for meritorious service for a busy year supporting numerous enforcement efforts and the security detail by presidential visit. So he was a commercially rated pilot in helicopters, also held single engine and multi-engine land airplanes, single engine sea airplanes. He was instrument rated for helicopters and airplanes, also held a flight instructor certificate for helicopters and single engine land airplanes, and an ATP with a rating for multi-engine land. He was also an A&P. By the time 2013 rolled around, he had 10,693 total flight hours, which almost 8,500 were in helicopters. It logged 250 or so hours simulated instrument and about 140 of actual instrument, mostly in airplanes, and all before 2001. His logbooks documented 38.3 of instrument flight in helicopters, of which half an hour was actual, and his last instrument helicopter flight was in 1986. So I know that was kind of long. I appreciate you bearing with me, but I think it's important to understand where this gentleman was coming from. So what do you think of his experience? Anything stand out to you? There were a couple of things, a few things that stood out to me that I'd like to share with you. On the positive side, he was a very experienced pilot, decorated, awarded, highly regarded by most of his peers. He was known for accomplishing rescues in adverse conditions, and I suppose you could look at that as a positive or a negative. He hadn't flown instruments in a helicopter in 27 years. I would look at that as a negative. Most of his instrument experience was in an airplane. I would also see that as a problem. He had no instrument experience in any aircraft in 12 years. Also a bit of a problem. So John has attached the PDF of the report that I'm drawing a lot of this information from. The NTSB did a fantastic job in compiling a very, very thorough analysis of this. It's quite lengthy, but it is a good read. A lot of other information that I'm not going to, present here and talk about here, just because of the length of time that we have. But worth the read, certainly. So we're going to talk about the event here. So this occurred on March 30th, 2013, and there's 3 people involved here. So let me just go over those 3 people so we don't get them confused. So you know Mel Nading already. Mr. Nading is a helicopter pilot. We also have Trooper Tage Toll. He was an Alaska State Trooper. And thirdly, we have Carl Ober. Carl is the gentleman in the top right that you see there with the baseball cap on. He was an injured and stranded snowmobiler. So that was what started all of this. So at about 7:35 p.m. on that Saturday, the state troopers received a cell phone call from Carl Ober. He said he was injured and stranded near Larson Lake. And I'm going to mess up this name because I'm not an Alaska native. Talkeetna, maybe? Okay. About 80 miles north of Anchorage. He reported that he had bruised his ribs and was concerned about hypothermia. Seems natural, a natural concern to me, up in Alaska in the middle of nowhere. At the time, there were no Alaska wildlife troopers on duty. So the wildlife troopers are state police officers, but of course they're kind of like the fish and game of many of the states around here. So they're a little bit more skilled in the wilderness survival. State Trooper Tage Toll called a man who lives at a remote cabin 6 miles north of Talkeetna and asked if he could search for Carl. The gentleman reported that there was a horrible mix of rain and snow starting to come down, and altogether the trip would be about 30 miles for him back and forth. And so he called up a couple of his buddies, experienced in backcountry travel, also called Denali National Park representative and asked their opinions, and everybody urged him not to go out on his own. So the trooper called back and said, "Are you in or out?" And the local gentleman said he was not comfortable going. The state trooper responded on the phone, "That's okay, I'll get the helo on it," and quickly ended the call. The search and rescue coordinator for the state troopers called Mr. Nading at 8:19 p.m. He was at home. He said he checked the weather before accepting the mission and then called back to say he'd go. So according to his wife, he checked the weather upstairs and came down dressed for flight. She asked him about the weather and he said it was good. That was all he said. The investigation team were not able to discover a record of what weather briefing he accessed. The area forecast at the time predicted some light rain, snow, some areas of visibility down to 4 miles at the time. To give you a little bit of background, the state of Alaska set its minimums for search and rescue at 502. Nading at one point wrote in an email to a colleague, and I don't have the rest of the context of this email, but he reported to a colleague that his personal limit was 200 feet and 5 miles visibility. So I did a little bit further looking because I want a little more weather information than that gave me. So at the time, Alaska International was forecasting calm wind, visibility greater than 6, light rain broken at 1,000, isolated rain and snow with viz down to 4 miles. Talkeetna Airport, which is about 4 miles west of where the helicopter ended up crashing, was calm 10 miles, light rain broken at 1,000, temp 2, dew point 1. Some additional information here. I said I'm not from Alaska, but as you know, it's sometimes when I assume based on the time of day that it's dark or it's light. That's not necessarily the case up there, but in this case, the mission was at night. It was dark. In fact, there was no civil twilight, and due to the overcast, there were no stars or moon available due to the cloud layers. He was wearing NVGs in that flight, and I want to just briefly explain. It looks like we had almost 50% in the EMS world, and most of you folks now are very familiar with those night vision goggles. But for those of you that aren't, the night vision goggles simply take the available light and make it brighter, so to speak, right? So if there's zero light, it can't amplify nothing. It's still dark. So the less light that you have, the less the NVGs work, if that makes sense to you. So they do offer an incredible capability, and that you can see in much lower light levels. But they still are dependent on some ambient light to function well. As they lose that light, they become very grainy, and it becomes very difficult to see. So for those of you that already know that, I apologize. For those of you that don't, there's a little helpful information. All right. So think to yourself now, I didn't put this as a poll question because this was too difficult to structure into a poll question. So I'd just like you to think to yourself, what are some pros and cons for accepting this mission? And I'm just going to pause here for about 15, 20 seconds. I want you to think to yourself. Okay, so some of the things that I thought about, some of the reasons to go is this gentleman, Carl Ober, is likely to freeze to death if left alone. He's obviously injured enough where he can't get back on his sled, his snowmobile, and make it back. He's obviously too far away from anybody else to get any kind of help, and even the locals that are close enough on foot don't even want to risk it. So it seems to me that there's a person's life at stake, certainly. Another pro is that his pilot experience. He was very familiar with the area, obviously done many search and rescues in Alaska, so he knew the terrain, he knew all the areas. I would assume he was very experienced with night vision goggles and with that particular make and model helicopter. And of course, the techniques and procedures that surround, taking off, landing in Alaska and flying in that remote area. Some of the cons that I thought about were the weather was marginal based on the reports that we had. The temp and dew point being close is concerning. The precipitation with such a low temperature is very concerning. Certainly the low clouds, visibility, lack of illumination. The helicopter was not certified for IFR, and this is something that is in that more detailed report. I didn't talk about all the equipment that the helicopter had just because in the interest of time here. And the third thing is the recent instrument experience. Being the conditions what they were. But realistically, even with recent experience based on low clouds and the freezing temperatures, and even if he was instrument rated, I wouldn't recommend flying in clouds at the freezing level. I've never flown an A-Star actually, but don't believe they have anti-icing or de-icing. So we're going to bring up another poll question, John, if you wouldn't mind.
You
Get
bet.
a little bit of input based on what we've talked about thus far.
Okay, so we're launching the poll question now. So based on the information you currently have available about this accident, would you accept the flight? Your choices are yes, no, or need more information. So vote frequently, vote often. And I can see that we're going through about 70% now of you that have voted. So we'll keep it open for a few more seconds and we'll share the answers.
Hey, John, this is Steve. I'm just going to mention while we're here on this poll question is we have found with some servers on the poll questions on GoToWebinar, if you have it across your entire monitor, you may be restricted in voting. You need to just minimize it down window-wise a little bit. If you have the screenshot icon at the top of your window, just above the poll question, you should be able to answer it then.
And I think that helped do the trick, Steve, because I can see that the number of responses is going up already. So that was a good call. Okay, so it looks like about 80% of you have voted, and that seems to be about it. So I'm going to close the poll at this point and then share the results with you. Okay, so based on the information you currently have available, would you accept the flight? And it looks like no is the leader when the answers at 61%. Need more information is number 2 at 34%. And yes is at 5%. So clearly no has a substantial lead there, followed by need more information. Okay, it's coming back to you, Matt.
Okay, thanks, John. So I'm not saying that there is a right answer at this point, and I would hope that we could all kind of put ourselves in that situation and imagine some of the pressures and things like that. And I don't assume that I would make the correct decision. I would like to think so, but I don't want to assume that, and I don't want you to either. So I would hope that our training and experience and our thought process and our risk assessment and mitigation would all come into play, and we're going to talk about more of that. But I think it's important to recognize that we're all fallible. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the sequence of events here. So we're going to get into more of the specifics of what happened on that night. So at 2100, the helicopter was towed out of the hangar. And so Mel Nading drove to Anchorage International, grabbed a helicopter, a couple of ground crew did a brief walk around, yanked it out, and was in the air and talking to MATCOM dispatcher at about 2117 hours. So he reported that he was off of Anchorage International and he was headed to Sunshine landing zone. And that was Sunshine is near the Talkeetna post. And he was headed to pick up a state trooper. So getting, obviously getting some assistance to go grab the stranded gentleman, Carl. So at 2142, he reported landing at Sunshine. And then at 2154, he radioed that he had spotted the snowmobiler and was landing nearby. The GPS data that was available during the investigation indicated the helicopter landed on a frozen pond about 0.2 miles from the stranded snowmobiler. At 2159, the trooper radioed that they were walking to get the snowmobiler and then reported reaching at 2220. They transported Carl back to the helicopter, and then all three departed the frozen pond at about 2213. So based on pictures and evidence they collected after, it appears that they were able to get the snow machine working, treated Carl briefly for some of his injuries, and then drove him back to the frozen pond and departed at 2313 hours. So at that time, the helicopter took off and climbed to about 250 feet above ground level and accelerated to 60 knots and continued southwest, then southeast around a small hill and continued south. So you can see from the satellite picture there, the departure point. So the departure point is that frozen pond where they left with Carl. So Carl was just underneath the power lines on the snow machine. So they pulled him out to the frozen pond and took off and then headed almost kind of back and forth there, slightly paralleling the power lines. So we're going to look at some brief animation that was put together to help better understand this accident. So I'm going to bring up this animation here.
The animation depicts the final 3 minutes of the 7-minute accident flight. The top of the screen shows Alaska Daylight Time, the altitude in feet above ground level, and the airspeed in knots. The left side of the animation shows a view from inside the cockpit, and the right side of the screen shows an external view of the helicopter. The animation does not depict the lighting or weather conditions at the time of the accident, which were night instrument meteorological conditions. In addition, the wooded terrain is not accurately depicted. At this time, the airspeed begins to decrease. The helicopter continues to slow until it almost stops. Weather data indicates that the helicopter likely encountered near zero visibility conditions due to snow showers. The helicopter begins a rapid vertical climb and left turn. The left turn continues past 180 degrees. The helicopter enters uncoordinated maneuvers, yawing left, rolling right, and pitching up. With the helicopter at high pitch and roll angles, the pilot caged the attitude indicator, resetting it to indicate a level flight attitude. The helicopter entered a series of erratic turns, climbs, and descents. The recorded images and data end shortly before ground impact.
So they did a very nice job putting that animation together. I think that really helps kind of understand what was going on, and it's a bit kind of a bit scary to watch, honestly. So let me give you a little bit of update on the weather. So it's been a little while since the initial weather was gathered at Anchorage. So weather at the time of the accident, so Talkeetna Airport, which as you remember was about 4 miles away, reported calm wind, 6 miles, light rain, mist, few clouds, 500, broken at 1500, temp 1 and dew point 1. Witnesses, residents in the area, reported occasional heavy snow, some mixed rain, freezing drizzle, and rain. So kind of just a real messy evening. So as you saw from the video, at about 11:18, Mel Nading initiated a rapid climb that appears to be consistent with inadvertent IMC. And then shortly after, he cages the attitude indicator. And if you saw what the attitude of the helicopter was at that point, I think the video did a nice job of highlighting that. It was just about pointed skyward. So a very, very bad time to pull an attitude indicator to cage it. And he was the furthest thing from straight and level. But at that point, I think we can probably assume that he was incredibly disoriented. His attitude indicator that he had on board was also limited. So once he got to the top, which is about 25 degrees in that particular case, the attitude indicator would stop. So he wouldn't have gotten a pitch indication any greater than that. Of course, in normal circumstances, when would you ever need a pitch indicator in a helicopter that went more than 25 degrees? But so it would have just frozen there until he came back to that 25 degrees. This is the picture of the impact site. You can make out the skids there. So unfortunately, the attempted rescue did not end well for those three men. The local paper reported after, it said, the crash is a sad epitaph for Hilo 1, which has been at the forefront of search and rescue efforts that have saved numerous lives over the years. In 2012, Mel Nading made more than 900 contacts with individuals while responding to rescue calls. So I think, could that have been you? What do most of us say? No, of course not. I never made such a dumb call, or I'd have turned back. So I want to share a little personal experience with you that was eerily similar to this flight, and I do this not to highlight that I have made dumb decisions, but to share that fact with others, because I thought I was a pretty awesome pilot at the time. And so I was on a similar mission, actually, as a snowmobiler as well, that had crashed in the Adirondacks and had a significant head injury. And so we went and picked up this snowmobiler, and due to the traumatic injury, had to go to Syracuse to get treatment for him. We couldn't go to a closer hospital. So we were on our way south down to Syracuse. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning. These things never seem to happen at a decent hour. It was not a horrible weather day, but as you move down south from the Adirondacks, the terrain actually rises up a little bit, and you typically get a big area of fog if the temp and dew point are close and you don't have any significant wind. And so that's what we ran into. So we didn't have any precipitation, but we had that fog starting to form, and it was very mission focused. I wanted to save this guy's life. I wanted to get him down there. I knew he was just about gone, and due to the fact that he had a head injury, I was being told by the paramedic in the back that altitude was an issue. They were asking me not to climb up too high if I didn't have to. And of course, these were back before the times when, you didn't discuss patient condition and things like that. And so I was very concerned, and I wanted to keep it low. And so as I came to that area, I did not climb up over what I knew was probably going to be some clouds. I tried to continue through. And for a while, it was fine. I made it most of the way, actually. Isn't that always the case? You're just about out of it. And visibility had remained, decent, not horrible. And then it just started getting worse and worse. Went from a few miles to 2 miles to 1 mile to a half a mile, and it just started narrowing in. And if you've flown goggles with deteriorating weather, we kind of know what I'm talking about. You see through a little bit of the stuff. The goggles do kind of a nice job, and so sometimes it sneaks up on you a little bit. But I knew the weather was getting worse, and I still didn't turn around or climb up. But it does kind of happen suddenly, where all of a sudden, you think you've got a half mile, a mile visibility, and poof, you're in the cloud. And I was obviously just lucky. Punched into the cloud. I didn't hit anything. I committed to the instruments. I climbed up and I got out of the clouds. And I said I was just lucky. It could have been a hill, a tower, a house. I mean, I was pretty darn low at the time, flying down roads, but certainly wasn't at a good safe altitude. And that was the mission mindset. I need to get this flight done. It's not that I didn't know what the risks were and I wasn't aware of the risks. I just put them aside. They just weren't important anymore. I was saving somebody's life. You know, I didn't even consider the fact that I could kill several other people in my attempt to save this person's life. It was just all about that mission completion, and I think you can get that whether it's a life-saving mission or not. I think you can have that mentality. So I appreciate you listening to that story. I like to share that just because you don't hear about the situations that, you know, people made it out of, right? You hear about it when it goes bad. Well, that time I made a really crappy decision, but you never heard about it because nobody was killed. I made it out. Nobody was the wiser. Except me, hopefully. So what went wrong on this flight? What do you think? What should have been done instead? What latent conditions set this accident up? And what are some lessons that we can learn? So some of the operational controls that the IHSF wanted to mention were assuring the weather is above minimum before starting, escalating go, no-go decision making when weather is found to be close to the minimum, and providing weather updates as the mission is progressing. Some equipment in the helicopter. The helicopter, of course, as we heard, was not certified for IFR. They also talked about the usefulness of MVGs and IMC. I would say MVGs are completely useless in IMC. And you've heard about the land and live. So they wanted to emphasize the land and live campaign. There were a lot of opportunities to abort the flight and in numerous places, from the beginning of the mission to picking up the stranded snowmobiler, you know, after picking up the trooper. You know, we weren't on board the helicopter. We didn't see what the weather was like as he was getting to that area and how many risks he was taking just to go and get the trooper in the first place, to go and try to find the snowmobiler. And of course, the procedures for IMC, so inadvertent IMC, you know, what procedures to use. So a brief epitaph, so to speak. So Carl was 56. He was a community volunteer in both the Talkeetna and Cantwell communities, which he called home. He was a dog musher, trapper, carpenter. Made some quality log furniture, according to friends and neighbors. Loved to ride a snow machine. Loved Alaska. Known throughout the community for his unstoppable cheer and kindness. Trooper Tage Toll was a wildlife trooper at one point himself. He'd also previously served with the Kansas Highway Patrol. He was 40 years old, and he was survived by his wife and 3 sons. Some corrective actions that the Alaska Department of Safety looked at. As you can see by this chart, Alaska is huge, if you didn't know that already. A lot of land to cover for the Alaska DPS folks. So they certainly don't have the easiest job in the world. The DPS operates 44 aircraft, including fixed wing and rotary wing, land and sea. They have 5 separate detachments throughout Alaska. The state of Alaska population, at least when this presentation was made, was closing in on 750,000. And the land area is 570,000. So that's a population density of 1.3 per square mile. So they're a bit spread out up there. A lot of land. I have never flown in Alaska. It must be something else to see all that open land. They have 5 PA-18 Super Cubs, 5 Cessna 185s. They have a couple of caravans. And oh no, they've got the old Robbie up there flying too. They've got 3 Robinson R-44 helicopters. Looks like one of them with the big old floaties on it. And of course, they've got the A-Star up there. and King Air 350. That's that incredible picture you see on the slide too. That's a heck of a backdrop. Oops, I went one too many. Hold on, let me go back to the previous slide. There's a couple of things I wanted to talk about before we moved on. I wanted to discuss a little bit of human factors. This isn't going to be a lecture on human factors, don't worry. I'm just going to talk about a couple of things. I wanted to mention before I got too much into it is that, you know, the human factor is why we have so many incredible successes, not just why we have failures. So when we say human factors, it's not just negative. I mean, it's a good thing. Having a human interface is a good thing. It's, in my opinion, it's an essential thing. So we just have to understand how those errors are made. So the problems in decision making, communication breakdowns, distractions, and all the other factors which contribute to the sum total of behavior in an accident, they exist even if the accident never happens. So we still going through those same processes, whether something bad happens, or something good happens. So, as you are aware, the FAA industry, you know, have come up with a lot of ideas and solutions to address some of these human factors issues. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with these in one form or another. You know, for those of you flying EMS, I would imagine you're familiar with the safety management system, as well as, you know, perhaps some of the other sectors. Larger 135s may have something similar to that, or maybe an unofficial safety management system. And of course, we've got a myriad of acronyms that have come out that are helpful in making decisions before and during the flight. The whole intent with all of these things is really to change the conditions in which we're making our decisions, if that makes sense. So we're, if we're making that second decision in the heat of battle, so to speak, it's much more difficult to make the decision. So if we can improve the conditions in which we have to make that decision, our chances go up of making a better decision. And that's a big part of the risk assessment and some of these other tools we're talking about is it's not putting ourselves in that position in the first place where it's so difficult to make a good decision. So as you've seen, many of these acronyms and risk assessment matrix and all these other things, sometimes it does look like it's just words on a page, and words on a page are certainly not enough. We've got to change our attitude as well to make those tools useful. And we have to accept that we're capable of making some bad decisions. So the NTSB, in response to this accident, issued some safety recommendations. As if you're not familiar with the process, they do this all the time. The FAA sometimes takes those safety recommendations. Well, I should say this, they always take them, but they're not necessarily implemented exactly as the NTSB recommends, but they are all taken into consideration. So here are some of the recommendations. The first, implementing flight dispatch and flight following, along with the second, was not as prevalent at that time. For those of you who are not aware, don't use anything similar to that, Spider Tracks, among other companies, is one of these that offers the satellite tracking. So that particular picture that you see down there is Spider Tracks that's on the dash, and you can set it up to give you reports every 2 minutes, for example. It'll just ping every 2 minutes a helicopter is flying. It'll tell you when certain parameters are exceeded. So when it descends faster than 1,000 feet per minute, or when it exceeds 50 knots, or things like that. So it's another helpful tool for the the person tracking the flight. So of course, as you know, and if you have any experience in 135 or the airlines, or so there's some different terminology that we like to throw around, and so somebody is not necessarily performing a flight dispatch if they're just monitoring a flight. But the intention here with the recommendation is to have the flight monitor, to have somebody doing some kind of a second set of eyes watching the flight as they're moving around. And these systems can also send an automated SOS message if certain parameters are exceeded, or if the unit loses power, or things like that. Another recommendation is to equip the pilots with sat phones for remote flight planning communication, to initiate night vision goggle training. There was some training in effect already. I think this is an expansion of what they had. Initiate periodic inadvertent IMC training, which if you've had a proficiency check in the 135 world, you know that that's mandatory now on that check, and that wasn't always the case. And so that's a hot button thing now, is regularly going through practicing those procedures and understanding what to do. Implementing an automated SMS flight risk assessment program. You EMS guys are probably intimately familiar with risk assessment stuff. And create a formal tactical flight officer training program. And I don't know if we had any law enforcement, because I grouped law enforcement in with everything else, but that's I guess similar to the EMS folks. If you get somebody on the aircraft, you might as well tell them what the heck is going on, so they're just not a rock over in the seat. I think that's kind of the intent of these programs, is to kind of teach them what's going on. And in the case of the tactical flight officer training program, teach them as well how to better differentiate their duties. And there's sometimes, as in the law enforcement world, having come from law enforcement as well myself, that sometimes the duties overlap. You want to be a cop, not a pilot. Some accomplishments, some good things that came out of this. They implemented the safety management system in January of 2015, trained air crews in operational risk management. They established a department safety and standardization committee, and the committee developed a hazard matrix, which resulted in the aircraft risk assessment matrix development. And so all good things. As we said before, though, that hazard matrix can just be words on a page. So you could spend a year developing a wonderful, wonderful risk assessment matrix, and it's not going to do a darn thing if you don't treat it with the respect it deserves, and have the right attitude going with it. So in the end, it really doesn't matter what the risk value of the flight ends up being, or who you have to call to get launch authority on that flight. Ultimately, it's you in the seat there. It's the PIC making the call out on the flight, and the conditions most likely have changed since you filled out that risk assessment matrix anyways. So the results that DPS reported was that they reduced their aircraft accident rate from an average of 2.6 per year to less than 1, and no fatal accidents or injuries since March of 2013. What the safety team wanted to point out is that reducing the accident rate from 2.6 to 1 or less than 1 is good, but with only 44 aircraft, the 2.6 rate possibly highlighted a culture problem. And they recommended, instead of measuring in terms of accidents per year, hopefully measure in years between accidents. They also mentioned that the initiatives listed in the previous slides help, but as I said, attitudes and behaviors also need to be addressed. That's always what it comes down to, isn't it? So do you think they missed anything critical? How can they affect the change in attitudes and behaviors? Well, go back to that first video that we watched. positive outcomes under adverse conditions are highly praised, and they're regarded, well, and they motivate us to take on and complete difficult tasks. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, certainly in and of itself. And, it's a lot of wonderful people out there. They just want to do the right thing. They want to help people. They, no matter what the flight is for, even if you're just transporting someone from A to B, if you're taking a friend from A to B out to go, look at the coastline or whatever, you want to give them that flight. You want to make that happen for them. So there's always a mission to be done, so to speak, and you always go into it wanting to get that task completed. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think we just have to understand that that's not the decision maker. That's certainly the reason for the flight, but that should not dictate what we do. I read an article in a popular rotorcraft magazine a couple of years ago, and I'm not gonna say who wrote the article, as I don't think it matters, but it was by a very experienced Vietnam era helicopter pilot, well awarded helicopter pilot. And in his article, he started off by saying we should learn from those more experienced than us. Great. A great start to the article, right? But then he proceeded to talk about a particular flight technique that he developed to get out of a hot LZ. Okay, well, cool to hear about, right? We've read Chicken Hawk and some of the other books. I love to hear about some of that stuff they did. But then he went on to say that we should be using this on flights out of LZs during normal operations. I said, well, wait a minute. Wouldn't you know, there wasn't a single negative comment in the months issues that followed, nothing online. Pilots I talked to about it saw no problem with that. In hindsight, I really should have written to this gentleman, but I didn't. Thinking back to my days of instruction, if you've been in instruction, students just do dumb things anyways. But one of the common things that I like to tell people is somebody shooting at you right now? Why are you responding in this way? Are there rounds coming through the cockpit? Then what's your rush? If you don't make it to the airport in the next 5 minutes, are you going to get shot out of the sky? If you don't get out of the LZ in the next 5 seconds, is your helicopter going to get shot up? Why do we still think that way so often as helicopter pilots? That somebody's lighting a fire underneath us and we need to move and we need to do it quickly. And it certainly bothers me when very experienced people encourage very risky takeoff procedures that have absolutely no place in civil aviation. No place at all. I've been a former military helicopter pilot myself. There's a lot of stuff I learned in the military that is just not applicable to civil aviation. And I learned that the hard way when I got to civil aviation. It is a completely different world. That sometimes it is difficult to see that. But nobody's shooting at you. Nobody's forcing you to go. There is just no reason that you have to commit to that mission above all else. It's not really life and death. So I've got a last poll question. John, would you mind bringing that up?
You bet. Doing it right now, Matt. Okay, here we go. Have you ever flown into deteriorating weather and regretted not turning around? Your answer choices: never, yeah, maybe a time or two, more than I'd like to admit, or is that bad? So please cast your vote, and we'll let you know what the results are.
And John, this is Steve, because we as organizers can't vote on this, but I'll put my vote in there is, yeah, maybe a time or two.
Yeah.
I have done that. I have regretted it.
Yeah, that would be my vote too, Steve. I agree.
And
Okay,
I think
yeah,
the
go ahead,
important
Matt.
part I've learned from it.
Right. Yeah, maybe a time or two. We're not saying, yeah, maybe 8 or 10 or two dozen times, you know, maybe a time or two, because my God, after you've done it a time or two, hopefully you have learned. The people that haven't learned and continue to do it are the folks that we read about. Okay, I'm going to close the poll. Looks like 75% of you have voted, and I'm going to share the answers with you. So here we are. Have you ever flown into deteriorating weather and regretted not turning around? Well, it looks like our choice, Steve, you know, maybe a time or two. Our experience, that's the #1 answer, 47%. Let's see, coming in at 29% is never. Coming in at 22% is more than I'd like to admit. And is that bad is 2%. So those are the results for you, Matt. Maybe a time or two leads the pack at 47%.
Okay. Well, thanks, John, and thanks everybody for answering. That's something I tried to think about on a regular basis, and you know, based on my background in flying, I've always fallen into that darn trap of mission mindset, and that's why I've spoken so much about it today, because it's personal to me. It gets me all the time. I'm just a very focused person. I want to get the flight done, whatever it is, and that's you know, that's caused me to take some risks in the past that I shouldn't have taken, and it's just difficult. It's difficult to get out of that. So I have come up with some techniques and that have worked for me, and I encourage you to think about it yourself, because something different, you know, probably works for you than does for me, or whatever it is. Some, you know, some aid in the cockpit, some memory device, or maybe some reminder before the flight, or maybe even a picture of a loved one in the helicopter, or whatever the heck it is, something to remind you what's really important and what you need to be focusing on during the flight. And the safety team and many others have also encouraged pilots to come up with some abort criteria. And as they're flying into deteriorating weather, whether that's, you know, if I, you know, slow down 30 knots, or if I descend, you know, or whatever the case is, you know, there's all different recommendations out there for that. But coming up with some rules of thumb, just like your personal minimums beforehand on when you're going to turn around, I think is very helpful, because if you regularly fly, whether you fly for fun or it's your job, or you work in EMS or you work in corporate, you're going to be flying in bad weather. You're going to be flying in less than ideal weather. And you can't turn down every flight because it's not unrestricted visibility and clear skies. You know, you'd be out of a job if you waited till only the crystal clear days with calm wind to go flying. So you do have to fly in less than ideal weather. So I think it's important to prepare ahead of time. At least I found that was, for me, that was really important to think about ahead of time, so that when I got to that point in the flight, it wasn't a decision anymore. I had already made the decision. I was just going to continue on as I had already decided to do. And that made it a lot easier for me. That kind of took the pressure off. So I didn't want to pull this, but I'm sure some of you know people that have died in helicopter accidents, whether they took some risks or not. Sometimes we don't know if that was the case or not. Sometimes there's not a lot of information. The accident in this case, they had an in-flight recorder, which was very helpful for, you know, getting a lot of the information after. And think about, could something like this happen to you? You know, are you capable of bad decisions? Are you capable of making a mistake? I would say yes. Now, I don't know each of you individually, but I know you're all people. and come up with, and you can do this after the presentation, come up with a few things that you can do yourself to prevent a similar outcome in your own flying career. What can you do? And make it personal, because everybody's different and everybody's mission is different. And everybody's flight environment and is different. And whether you're taking your family up for fun or you're taking a patient from A to B. And then will you share this? I'm sure most pilots are familiar with this accident already, but hopefully we can have some honest conversations as pilots. I know helicopter pilots in particular, we tend to be a little grumpier and keep to ourselves, and we like to think we're awesome, and don't like when somebody threatens our ego, and all conversations with helicopter pilots seem to end up back at aerodynamics sometime. I don't know why helicopter pilots love to talk about aerodynamics so much, but let's talk about something else. Let's have some honest discussions about risk assessment, weather, departure and route, equipment, fitness for flight, personal minimums. Share your personal minimums with somebody else. Find out what their personal minimums are. I think I know I've told myself, several times in the past, well, the weather's not great, but it's probably okay. Let me give it a try. I can always turn around. But once you put yourself in that position, it's difficult to turn around. It's much easier just to not go in the first place than it is to get to that point and say, should I turn around? Well, it's only another mile. I'm almost there. I mean, how much worse could it get in a mile, right? So it's just sometimes the longer you go, the harder and harder the decisions are. And it's almost like the right decision is impossible at that point. And maybe that's how Mel Nading felt. Maybe he just kept going and going. And by the time he was where he was at, he just felt like there was no other decision. I can't turn back now. I've come so far. At this point, the weather behind me is just as bad as the weather in front of me. So I might as well just go forward. And so it is much easier if we just don't get put in that situation in the first place. And then, as I said, if we have some solid abort criteria, is helpful. So are you using the best, that skipped forward there, using the best practices for safety? The safety group there at IHSF put up some additional references there, the safety management. Of course, you can go and get all of this information from their website. They've got a lot of great information on their website. They are very concerned with helicopter maintenance, of course, and are a good resource. And they also have this this link here, which is the global survey. I didn't put the link because it's pretty easy to find on their website. So if you go on their website, you'll be able to find it easily. But they like to get that information surrounding some of their key recommendations. So they've come up with 4, and they wanted me to share 4 key sets of recommendations that have come out of some of these case studies. The first is a safety management systems. Using the safety management systems to manage risks that are practical. These systems are practical for all sizes of operators, from large ones to individual owners and operators. Emphasis on training, certainly training in inadvertent IMC, but just training in general. Familiarity with systems and equipment, especially mission equipment, mission-specific equipment. And finally, maintenance. So those are their 4 main recommendations or areas of focus. So thank you for attending this meeting. I hope I didn't bore you too much or ramble on. Please talk about this with other pilots. Make it personal. Talk about your experiences that you've had in situations like this. Share the mistakes that you've made. We can't all be heroes and we're not all perfect. I know that's not the case. You get a group of helicopter pilots together and you'd think every single one of them was, you know, God's gift to aviation. And I know that's not the case. So when you get together, let's try to share some of the mistakes that we've made so that we can learn from some of those, especially if a pilot's you know, a fellow pilot in the local area, and you know, just share the information that that will help your, you know, your fellow pilots. All right, so I think the